Hello, people of Pinkbike. I'm Dario, and with me here today is the Kavenz VHP16, which I think just might be the ultimate commenter dream bike. It's got high pivot, a gearbox, it's made of aluminum, it's got mixed wheels, it's modular. It's checking all the boxes for you people in the comments, and I've been living with this thing for over 6 months now. We've put each other through a lot and come out the other side as friends. I'm gonna get you into all the nitty-gritty details on this, but first some broad strokes. As I'm running it, it's 160 mil rear wheel travel with a 170 fork. As I mentioned, it has mixed wheels, and I'm running it in a stock geometry package for the size extra large that I have. I'm gonna run you through my climbing impressions first, then get into some frame details, and then all the other stuff will follow. So stay tuned. All right, climbing on the VHP16. A real mixed bag, if ever there was one. I think that you have to separate this bike into the frame and the drivetrain, because unfortunately the drivetrain has a pretty big impact on how the bike pedals, but it's important to note that this bike comes in a non-gearbox layout as well. Bearing the lead a little there. The gearbox is not amazing to pedal. It's kind of no surprise. They are known to have more drag than a regular drivetrain, and lo and behold, that is true. I have put a tremendous amount of time into this bike, and the drag has improved as I've, beat it in, but it's still not like a real get up and go feeling. It's, I don't know. It's a bit of a weighted bat. I think that, the positives for some people will outweigh that big negative, but it's important to remember that if you're looking for an efficient feeling pedaling experience, the gearbox might not be it. Luckily, when you do kind of discount the gearbox element, this bike pedals really well. It's got a lot of support. The geometry is well maintained, even through kind of bumpy climbs, technical bits. It maintains traction well. I think, they've made the most of the high pivot system here, but there are drawbacks to the high pivot. There's all the secondary drivetrain drag that comes as a result of running a chain over a bunch of different pulleys. So another can of worms. All right, climbing details done. I want to talk about the frame elements of this bike, as it is quite unique. So, as you can see, this has a gearbox. There are two versions of the VHP. There's the gearbox and the standard drivetrain. We chose to go with the gearbox just to see how Pinion's progress has gone and to get a real long-term sense of living with the E-Shift system. So I will touch on the E-Shift in the livability section later on, but suffice to say, we went with the gearbox here, and as part of that, there are a bunch of secondary drivetrain elements that are required in order to integrate it into the frame. Chief among those is a bash guard chain tensioner that bolts directly into the gearbox and is the only thing keeping tension on the chain as you cycle the suspension. That was the roughest detail on the secondary drive system, but luckily Kavenz is already iterating on it. Long story short, I was shipped the bike with some bolts that were too short for that thing. The bash guard hit a rock, as you do, pulled those bolts out. They had me replace them with longer bolts, which held for quite a long time, but eventually those gave way as well. And they have now redesigned the item with better support and obviously longer bolts in the bill of materials. So it should be more robust, but that was the thing that gave me a headache the most. And I think there is some inherent concern with putting a very important chain tension item packaged in with a pretty frail and, susceptible to damage thing like a bash guard. So that aside, the rest of the secondary drive system is pretty simple. Kavenz uses a really high quality stainless steel idler pulley. I have not had any wear issues with that. It's fairly quiet if you keep your chain lubed. And obviously, other Gearbox bikes go with belts. Kavenz decided to go with a chain. In my eyes, that's probably because the majority of their other models use a chain-driven system, so it's just easier to integrate those details. But I'm sure there are people out there who would love to see this bike with a belt. The belt does run more quietly, but for me, it's like, I know how to maintain a chain. It's been fine, though I would probably enjoy this bike with a belt just the same. Other frame details, this bike has internal cable routing that I kind of used. I ended up putting the brake externally because I used this bike as part of a larger brake test, but more on that later. You can't see it, but underneath the bottle boss is a battery in the down tube that you have to charge about every 6 months to keep the drivetrain shifting. Not a big issue, not a thing that ever moved. It's just there and you don't know about it. The rest of the pinion system was actually pretty simple. I mean, obviously there's the break-in period, as I touched on in the climbing, and that is kind of brutal, but if you can get over that, then it's sweet. It's got great dropper insertion. I'm running a 242 mil post here, and there's room for me to drop it down even further. They also use the same bearing size tip to tail, which is a really nice detail and makes maintenance that little bit easier. One other frame thing to discuss, which kind of opens a whole can of worms, but basically the way Kavenz has approached a model lineup is by having the same base frame across the board and using the lower shock mount, shock, fork, and dropout bolt-ons to change the travel and the wheel size. So you have 4 overarching models. There's the VHP12, 14, 16, and 18. As mentioned, I'm testing the 16 here, but broad strokes, you can take the VHP platform anywhere from a 120, 130 XC bike all the way up to a 180, 200 mil downhill bike. So it's quite versatile. Obviously, there's like trade-offs in terms of weight and geometry as you make all of those changes, but I think Kavenz has done a really good job of integrating all of that modularity into a pretty approachable concept. Like, even compared to what Trek has done with their most recent fuel lineup, Kavenz's is a more simple and, I think, easier to understand concept. As to whether the average user will end up using those tools, I don't know, but for me, I think the 16, as I've been testing it, is like a pretty ideal position in the lineup. It's kind of a do-it-all long travel bike, and it does it all. Along those notes, I'm going to get into the descending performance, and then I'm going to run you through the geometry.
All right, it is after 4 p.m. in northern Washington on a particularly slimy day, which means it is basically the middle of the night. So hopefully the new camera can see it a bit better than my human eyes can as I take the Kavenz down a nice slimy track. Sorry if you get any lens specs, but you know, it may take a little more effort to get up the hill, but Kavenz is quite fun down the hill. It's different than a regular drivetrain bike, primarily in how fluttery the rear end feels. Having not ridden the railer equipped version of this, I can't really speak to exact differences there, but the back end of this bike is super sensitive, so a lot of grip, good traction, and a really nice quality under braking thanks to the kinematic they went with. I think the bike doesn't squat too much, stays active, allows you to like pump for traction as opposed to like hoping that that squat effect is going to dig in for you. The geo of the bike, I think, is really well sorted. I like this slightly steeper head angle that they went with here, just because it keeps the bike, I'd say, easy to place. You know, with the short ass rear end that this starts with, the wheelbase is actually quite tidy, but when you hit high speeds and G-ups like that, it grows, gets more stable, and feels like you can really push into it. You know, if I were setting this bike up for racing, I think I would probably err on the longer chainstay just for a bit more starting stability. I think as I have it set up here, the bike feels like more, I don't know, lively, fun than you might expect for like a big high pivot aluminum thing. You know, if you're like scraping down kind of pokey tech like this, I'd say the bike feels like, I don't know, it's easy to place, which is a pretty nice thing compared to some of the other very long and growing high pivots I've been riding recently. You know, this is just a bit more balanced.
That's the Kavenz on the downhill. It's quite good. You know, it's a high pivot, kind of funky bike in a way, but I think for me, I got along with it quite well. And I'm not always a huge fan of high pivots, so kudos to them. The geometry of this bike is kind of modular, which is why I've been avoiding talking about it too much, but there are a couple fixed things to discuss. It has a 64-degree head tube angle with a 170 fork and a 77.5-degree seat tube angle, which I think are both modern numbers that work all over the place. Like, the seat angle isn't super steep on paper, but because the bike has such high anti-squat, it never feels like it's sagging over the rear axle, and you always feel pretty central on the bike. The head tube angle for me is slack enough for pretty much anything. I've been riding this bike all over the map, and I've found that it works really well. The chainstay length is a little complicated, but it starts at 419 millimeters on every sized bike, but you bolt on either a +0, a +10, or a +20 millimeter dropout. So you change the starting length quite drastically depending on how you have it set up. I'm running it with a +10, so that means my bike starts at 429 millimeters rear center. And then as you cycle the suspension, it grows 20 millimeters again. So it's like you start at 429, you grow all the way up to 449. And I would say that the experience of riding the bike feels similar to your average longer chainstay horse length bike. It's like, yes, it's the high pivoty thing of like, sometimes it's short, sometimes it's long, but I've found this one pretty easy to intuit, which is nice. You know, the touchy-feelies on that differ quite a bit, high pivot to high pivot, and I think for me, this has been really easy to get used to, which is kind of the best thing I can say about it. That's the Geo, more or less. This is an XL of the 6 size range, so if you really want all the details, please go to the article. I have all of them laid out more cleanly there. I want to talk about the livability of the Kavenz, because it's been challenging, but I think we've come to a pretty happy and understanding place. As I mentioned in the frame details, that bash guard chain tensioner thing gave me a heap of trouble. Because we've addressed it and we know what the issue is, I think that's hopefully something that will not plague any customers out there, but just know that that's something I dealt with, and as written in the article and mentioned earlier, like, we know exactly why it happened. Other livability things really come down to whether you are a Pinion person or not. It's doing what it was promised to do. It packages a drivetrain into a can. You've got 12 speeds down there. I think the drag and the kind of like fussiness of the secondary drive system make it pretty niche still. I don't foresee this being the like every person's choice, but if you're someone who prioritizes descending and doesn't mind sacrificing a lot of climbing efficiency, then it's a solid option. Like, you know, I've put the months of time into breaking it in, and I now feel comfortable riding this thing with friends. It did take a bit to get to that point, but now that I'm there, yeah, it does the job. The other interesting and I think compelling stuff with living with this bike is just how drastically you can change it. Wheel size, chainstay length, travel, like the whole vibe of the bike can be massively altered to suit your use case and to change with the times even. That just opens up tuning to the rider. You know, I don't think Kavenz is a brand appealing to like the person who just wants to like get a bike and not think about it at all. This is like the tinkerer's bike ultimately. You know, they only sell them frame only, so you already have to have that kind of level of interest. And I think for that person, this is a really cool bike. That kind of gets me into the final pros and cons and ultimately who this bike is for. So let's head there. I'm gonna start things off with the cons. And the first one for me is going to be the gearbox. I think Pinion has done a pretty good job here, like a commendable job, really. Like it's 12 speeds packaged super tightly. The shift quality is not nearly what you get out of a modern cable or wireless system from SRAM or Shimano, but it does the job, and I think it's getting closer. For me, ultimately, the con there is just the complication that it elicits with the secondary drive system, and I think for me, there's also the concern of being able to work on it yourself. Though I haven't had any issues yet, it's one of those things that like if something were to come up, it's not as plug and play as other bike parts are. And say you're on a trip and you total your gearbox for some unforeseen reason, like that could be the end of riding the bike. So it's a bit of a concern for me, but still something that has worked for this test period and I think is going to work well for some users. The other con for me is going to be the weight. As I have it built, this bike is 40 pounds, and I wouldn't say that I'm doing anything too extreme. You know, it's like the build that you would put on a bike of this nature. It's got a 38, carbon wheels, double down to downhill tires, you know, riser bar, 240 post. It's like nothing extreme. I'm not running inserts. I'm not running crazy heavy tires. I'm just running the bike as you'd probably do so yourself. So 40 pounds is a lot, especially when you have extra drag coming from the drivetrain. So, you know, that's not the fairest thing because it is just a frame-only bike. You could build this super light if you wanted to, but as a representative build, it's pretty beefy. Luckily, that's it for the cons. We're going into the pros now. The pro, number one, this bike is really good. It just descends well. It's got remarkable suspension performance, and I think is competitive with the best high pivot bikes I have ever ridden. I would put it on par with the Trek Slash in terms of balancing the high pivot bump eating performance with the predictability and quality of suspension that it offers. And I think it edges out a lot of other kind of hot button high pivots that I've ridden recently. So huge kudos to Kavenz on that front. I think they've done a really good job with the suspension and the geometry and just the general feel of the bike. Another pro is going to be some of the details of the Pinion. You know, it's a mixed bag ultimately, and I think it offers some things and takes some things away. One of the pros of the Pinion system is the ability to shift on the descents while you're coasting. I think that's a pretty cool element and something that has changed the way I ride the bike. Say you're going down some gnarly techie thing where you can't possibly pedal, but there's a weird climb coming up, you can preemptively drop a couple gears, get ready for that, and motor up it. You kind of need to do that because you can't shift this under power, so it's, you know, sides of the same coin, but suffice to say that I've enjoyed having that utility. The last pro for me is just how modular this frame is. Again, you can change the character of it pretty drastically depending on how you set it up, and though I think that the setup I have here is a pretty good do-it-all platform, you could choose as a customer to change things however you like, and I think that's great. It's good to have choice, and it is a platform where, like, my assumptions are that you couldn't really put yourself in too bad of a corner. Like, it's going to be an interesting bike no matter what. Finally, who is this bike for? You know, I've been puzzling with this thing for months now, and I've come away really enjoying the way it rides. I think in order to do so yourself, and I'm talking about the Pinion version of the bike specifically, you're going to want to be patient, you're going to want to be a tinkerer, and you're going to want to be someone who either only descends the bike or is down to suffer for a little bit to get it broken in. It's offering a lot for the drawbacks that come with the gearbox integration, and I think for a lot of the right user, it will be worthwhile. Like, it's dead silent on the descents. There's a lightness to the rear wheel because of the unsprung mass that is like pretty special. And I think though the bike seems super exotic and unusual, that ultimately hides the fact that it's just a really good mountain bike. And though the like climbing performance is kind of hampered by the drag that you get from the system, it does a great job and like has proven to be something that I keep pulling out for the right ride. So if that sounds like you can head to Kavenz's website and check it out. But please go to the article. I have written way too many words about this bike, and you can read them at your leisure. And head to the homepage, check out all the other stuff we've got going on. There's a lot. So stay tuned, and I'll see you soon. That's too many thoughts about a gearbox bike, man. Oy.